I'm Rabbi Jessica Graf. I'm the senior rabbi here at Congregation Shereth Israel, and I want to dedicate this wonderful conversation today to the memory of our beloved Rabbi Martin Wiener, our Rabbi Emeritus, who served Congregation Shereth Israel and the Jewish people for decades and decades, who is a very active member of the American Jewish Committee, loved the work of AJC and served on the board here, the San Francisco Regional Board, and I understand the board in Baltimore as well when he was a rabbi in Baltimore. So this was an organization very dear to his heart, and he really felt that it was very important to understand world politics through a Jewish lens. And this was one of his beloved organizations. So we dedicate this to his memory. He passed away last Thursday and was buried just yesterday morning. So it's very fresh for all of us. And this is a wonderful way to honor his legacy. I want to thank particularly Rabbi Serena Eisenberg, who made this day happen, who works miracles to bring incredible people to us. And today we have the great privilege to have David Harris with us. I'll let John introduce him, but I'll say that in addition to all of the wonderful work of AJC, John and I met through AJC. So this is an organization that personally and professionally, we really love and revere and are grateful to. So I'll introduce him now and he'll introduce our speaker. Many of you have gotten to know Dr. Jonathan Graf through this From the Frontline series. Full disclosure, I am married to him, but he has been our guide through these conversations at Congregation Shereth Israel and for the community on COVID. We've called them From the Front Lines, and they have expanded now to really include current events outside also of the medical realm. So many of you have had a chance to hear him ask lots of interesting participants questions about COVID and what's happening in the world. What you may not know is that he is also on the AJC National Board of Governors and is really committed to this organization. So today he will be helping us to navigate this conversation with David Harris about Russia, Ukraine, and all that's going on in the world. So I welcome you all and turn this over to John to introduce our amazing guest speaker today.
So I'm going to put my volume on. Okay, good. So thank you, Jessica, very, very much for the very kind introduction. This is probably what, the 6th or 7th program I've done now from the front lines. But although I'm a doctor, this is the one that's perhaps most personal to me because I get to actually be in conversation with probably my favorite person outside of my own immediate family, I think, in the whole world. And that's David, who I've known now for almost 2 decades and who has inspired me in so many ways. David has led AJC since 1990, and that's actually a very momentous time, both in AJC's affairs and in world affairs, as we're going to talk about. He's been described by people such as the late Shimon Peres, president of Israel, as foreign minister of the Jewish people. And having worked with David personally for the last 2 decades, I can say that that's an absolutely accurate statement. But on a personal level, in addition to being AJC's CEO and sort of navigating the organization as it transformed itself really into a global Jewish organization, advocating on behalf of Jewish causes around the world, David has, and is a perfect, I think, subject for an expert for today's talk, has a personal interest and personal knowledge in what the current events that are going on today in Central and Eastern Europe. I believe, David, you're a 2nd generation Jewish American born of parents from the former Soviet Union. David famously, after graduating from Penn, rather than running off and joining a prominent Wall Street financial firm like everybody else I knew when I went to Penn, made his way to the former Soviet Union where he smuggled textbooks, I believe is the story, until he was expelled by the Soviet authorities to Italy, where he met his own wife as well, so in similar fashion, and then later led the movement and the March on Washington that I was a part of in the late 70s to free Soviet Jewry, and then subsequently became the CEO of AJC. I sort of bring that all in context because, David, when you became CEO in 1990, and I think this is very, very relevant to what we're going to talk about today, even though we're going back 30 years, the world was at a momentous period of time. The former Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Eastern Europe was being transformed. And, you know, obviously, with the exception of the mass Jewish emigration that was occurring from the former Soviet Union, it was not a foregone conclusion that a Jewish organization or a Jewish person in America really should care about geopolitical affairs on such a personal level. But you pivoted the organization in 1990, 1991 to really push hard for recognition of the sovereignty and independence of a democratic Ukraine specifically. And Ukrainian officials have acknowledged that even today, 30 years of institutional memory matters. That seems like an obvious thing nowadays, right? So everyone recognizes Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, except for Putin. But in 1991, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. I just read a very interesting article that described intense discussions going on in the Bush 1 administration between Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, who pushed very, very hard for an independent Ukraine, and James Baker, who was the Secretary of State, arguing not so fast, because there was concern that unstable former Soviet republics, such as Ukraine, would be in charge of the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world at the time, and so didn't push for that. But you aggressively put an American Jewish organization on record as supporting and lobbying for an independent, democratic, and sovereign Ukraine. Why? Why did we care about that in 1990?
So first of all, thank you, John, my friend. Also my medical advisor in one important moment in our family's life, with our youngest son still in college. Thank you, Jessica, for hosting us. And I had the pleasure of being in your parents' home a few years ago and meeting your family as well. Thank you to my colleague, Serena Eisenberg, who's been introduced already as our ambassador, if you will, in the Bay Area. And thank you all for joining this afternoon. So, John, to dial back, my mother's from Moscow. I grew up in a Russian-speaking home. So I was second generation, but I was probably generation 1.5, because I was much closer to my family's origins than most American children might be. So I spoke Russian at home. I also studied Russian in high school on top of that and in college. And as you said, after university, I did go to the Soviet Union. But I detested the Soviet Union. I can't say that strongly enough. My family hated the Soviet Union. They fled the Soviet Union. They were refugees from Stalin. I heard their stories. But then in 1974, I myself went and lived in the Soviet Union until, as you said, I was arrested and expelled from the Soviet Union. And then I began working in Rome and Vienna, two European cities, for 3 years, which were the destination points for Jews coming out of the Soviet Union, those lucky enough to be able to leave. And I literally met thousands of Jews from across the Soviet Union, including across Ukraine. And I heard their individual stories. I often had to record them for their emigration process. So by the time 1989 rolls around, and there are the first cracks in the wall, quite literally, the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Empire, I thought that this was a historic moment, and not just for the world, but for us as Jews. And by 1991, the last crack in the wall led to the end of the Soviet Union itself. And for me, as a newbie, as AJC CEO, I saw an unparalleled historic opportunity for the Jewish people. So not just for the broader human rights struggle and the broader effort to expand democracy, which are vitally important, but for the Jewish people. Why? Well, for one thing, the countries we were talking about were the havens for just about every anti-Israel group and terrorist on the planet. They were funding and they were training these terrorist groups. They were giving them safe haven from those looking for them. They conjured up the Zionism as racism idea in 1975. I thought this was an opportunity to transform relations with Israel, number one. Number two, those of us who've been involved all those years with Jewish communities behind the Iron Curtain were always living on a knife's edge. We could be detained, we could be arrested, we could be interrogated. It wasn't fun. I know it. It wasn't fun. All of a sudden, the ability to reunite the Jewish people, to rediscover Jewish communities, to undo the damage of cultural genocide was possible. Number three, the whole Holocaust story behind the Iron Curtain was largely buried from 1945 forward, John. Places like Babi Yar, very relevant in this moment in Kiev, never even had a proper memorial that referenced Jews as victims. It was all buried. The Soviet Union did not want to allow the possibility of the reemergence of Jewish identity or Jewish nationalism. So an enormous opportunity to rediscover or discover the Holocaust history really at the center of the Shoah. So I was given quite free rein when I took the job at AJC in 1990. And I thought, my goodness, this is a once in a lifetime moment. And I saw the opportunities for the Jewish people. I saw the ability to position AJC. And then finally, to your specific point, why Ukraine? And why only AJC? And yes, it was only us, John. And the answer, I think, is really quite obvious, at least to me. For many Jews, they could not look beyond the past. And Ukraine's past was not a pretty past for the Jews. By the way, nor was the Baltic past, nor was the Polish past. I can keep going. We were very mindful of the past. Both of my parents are survivors of the Shoah. So all my life, I've been sensitive to this. But the difference about AJC is that we also are able to learn from the past, but not be imprisoned by the past. The whole notion of AJC is we're determined to become authors of history and not its prisoners. So most Jews didn't want to touch Ukraine, with or without the Soviet Union. We said, for all the reasons I mentioned above, let's take a chance. And by the way, 40 million Ukrainians deserve to be free of Soviet communism. And so we were there alone. We were lobbying President George H.W. Bush. I was very much involved. He was very reluctant. You told the story a few moments ago about Jim Baker and Dick Cheney. It's true. George Bush was very reluctant. He didn't want to create new problems for Gorbachev, who already had more than his share. But we felt then, and by the way, we feel now, you can't turn a country like Ukraine into some pawn that somehow cannot fulfill its own destiny because someone else has a concern elsewhere, in this case, Moscow. So that, I think, explains why AJC stood out completely alone and has been consistent since 1991 in our support for Ukraine.
It's fascinating to hear you tell the story over 30 years, you know, and how this has evolved and how I think Ukrainians have come to view their relationship with America, but even more so with Jews and with an American Jewish organization and with their own internal Jewish community. Can you, and this is, I think, part of the reason why there's been so much transformation, I think, over the last 30 years in this country with such a checkered history. Can you describe the Ukraine of today? Is it more like Tevye's Ukraine, you know, going back a century ago, or is it truly a 21st century, you know, modern country and a very different environment for its 300,000 Jewish inhabitants today?
I think the easiest way to answer that, John, is through the prism of one person. And my guess is that the 110 people on this call know exactly who that one person is. That one person happens to be the president of Ukraine, democratically elected, that one person may well be the single most popular politician in the world today, the single most admired and courageous politician in the world today. And his name is Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, a Jew whose grandfather was one of 4 brothers, 3 of whom were murdered at Babi Yar, and the 4th miraculously survived and produced a grandson who is today the president of Ukraine. And if I may say, though he's Jewish, it has in no way triggered any evidence of anti-Semitism. To the contrary, he has unified a country which has often been fractious in a way that no one has seen before. And I think he's striding the globe like a colossus. And he's in an untenable position. I'm happy to talk more about that. But he's the president of Ukraine. By the way, in the previous government, the prime minister of Ukraine was also a very proud and identifiable Jew. Now, John, you tell me, in all those other countries where we don't assign as much historic anti-Semitism, tell me how many countries outside Israel have had both a president and a prime minister who are Jewish?
And a defense minister, mind you. I believe the current defense minister is Jewish too in Ukraine.
By the way, just in parentheses to this point, I'll give a trivia question to this group. Name me one country behind the Iron Curtain, formerly behind the Iron Curtain, that had 3 consecutive Jewish foreign ministers and a fourth foreign minister who was a Catholic, but who was a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, and who, when he took his position, famously said, including to us, Israel today can now boast it has not 1, but 2 foreign ministers. What's that country? 3 consecutive Jewish foreign ministers, plus a righteous among the nations. And it'll surprise the group, because the answer is Poland. So if we stay in the past, John, we'll go nowhere. It's like running on a treadmill. You go nowhere at the end of the day. We took a bet on Ukraine. It was not an irrational bet. It was a rational bet. And we proved that we bet correctly, John. And we've stuck with Ukraine for 31 years. But now we're meeting at a time when its very future is very much in doubt. And I hope we'll talk about that a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And that leads me to the next question, which is, first of all, you were in Ukraine in January, as recently as January. And I loved your briefing to us on the Board of Governors, where you were slotted a 20-minute meeting with basically the second highest ranking person in the government of Ukraine and what would have been the foreign minister were he not sick. You were wedged between the CIA director, I think, and from the US, obviously, and the US National Security Advisor after you. And your 20-minute meeting ended up going for an hour. And so that means that the National Security Advisor had to wait for you. So you were there, you were on the ground. Tell me why at this moment, at this exact moment, it matters for American Jews to care about Ukraine, to care about the transatlantic relationship, to care about democracy in this part of the world, rather than even a benevolent dictatorship, and to care about American leadership as a part of this alliance. Why is this so crucial now? And how do you analyze the situation in terms of what we should be doing as America, as American Jews?
Well, not only was I there in January on a solidarity visit, I was there in October. And this morning, I was asked by President Zelensky to join him on a private telephone conversation with 3 other people, 4 of us from the United States, meeting with the president of Ukraine privately for 30 minutes in the midst of war. So I can answer your question against the backdrop of October, of January, of today, and everything in between, John. Look, to me, there are many ways of trying to reply. For those of us who are students of history, I hope that's all of us on this call, what's the central lesson of the 20th century? The central lesson of the 20th century is appeasement does not work. A failure of imagination does not work. We refer frequently to Munich, 1938, to Neville Chamberlain returning from Munich to Britain, telling his countrymen to go to have a good night's sleep because peace in our time is prevailing. Well, I don't want to get into comparisons between 1938 and 2022 because they distract and people start arguing about whether they're exact comparisons or not. I'm not here to make an exact comparison, and I don't want to divert from the key moment. Vladimir Putin has challenged not just Ukraine, but has challenged the world. He's engaged in a kind of brinkmanship that we have not seen in how many decades, John?
7.
It's not that the world is rosy and problem-free, but we're now facing a different order of magnitude. We're talking about a president of Russia who has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, imagine for a moment the implications just of that one statement, who has threatened with fire and brimstone any country that offers military assistance to Ukraine. And given his track record until now, which did not begin with Ukraine, it began with Moldova, Transnistria, it began with Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, it began with Belarus, it began with Crimea and Donbass in Ukraine in 2014. This is a man who is set on a mission. We have to face reality. And the last thing in the world many people want to do today is to face reality. They'd rather avert their eyes, they'd rather look the other way, they'd rather try and gloss it over, or even, God forbid, rationalize Putin's behavior. I don't think any of those work today, John. He is who he appears to be, and we have to come to terms with that. We don't like it. We don't have the appetite for it. I get it. So why did he do it now? I think it's a really interesting question. And if I had to guess, it's because he senses a moment of weakness.
Right.
And look, for those who want to believe they understand Putin, I have news for us. President Bush did not understand Putin. He famously looked in Putin's eyes in Ljubljana 20 years ago, claimed to have seen his soul. There was no soul. He deluded himself. President Obama mocked Mitt Romney during the 2012 debate when Romney spoke about the reemerging danger of Russia. And Obama laughed at him. Trump thought that he could manipulate Putin with his salesman-like tactics, a lot of flattery, a lot of schmeicheling, we would say in Yiddish. Not even going into the whole Ukraine story. He couldn't make a dent in Putin. Whatever Trump had met before, he had never met Putin. And Biden had his famous tweet when he said, the last person in the world that Putin wants to become the next president of the United States is me, because I'm the only one who's gone toe-to-toe with him. His words, toe-to-toe. Well, sure, it looks like Putin was deathly afraid of Joe Biden. So let's be honest, 4 presidents, each, if they wished, with the NSA, the CIA, the embassies, the whole apparatus of the US government, all the brains of this country at their fingertips, all 4 got Putin wrong. They all underestimated him. And the reason they underestimated him, I believe, is because in our lives in the United States, we meet some bad actors, but Putin is in a very different category. And I urge those of you who may not have read it, though it's now 10 years old, to read Masha Gessen's biography of Putin called The Man Without a Face. She herself is originally from the Soviet Union. Some of you will know her name from the New Yorker. It's a fascinating book and it's still relevant. We don't understand that typology, John. And that's why everyone got him wrong. Everyone underestimated him. Everyone thought that they uniquely could somehow work with him and maneuver him and mold him. And look where we are today. So what does Putin see? He sees a world that underestimates him. He sees a world that is exhausted from COVID. He sees a world that is very deeply polarized within key countries like the United States, with almost policy paralysis in Washington. He sees an administration in Washington, which one has to say, created a debacle in Afghanistan, showing, again, weakness to the world. And we hear about it almost every day in our travels. He saw a world in which Angela Merkel, the stalwart of Germany for 16 years, left to be replaced by an untested new regime. He saw a French president who was distracted, he thought, by a presidential election. So he saw a moment of weakness, a moment of opportunity, and he seized it. He seized it. And our challenge now, somehow, is to prove him wrong. How we do that, I think, is enormously challenging, John. But if we don't prove his calculation wrong, no one should be under any illusion. Ukraine is not the end of the story. And by the way, not just vis-a-vis Russia, but let me add, I assure you that China, North Korea, and Iran, among others, are microscopically watching what's happening minute by minute by minute. And if they believe that an opportunity is opened for them when the United States is busy, is distracted, is diverted, don't for a single moment think that Iran won't act, or China won't act, or North Korea won't act. They will. And our leadership globally will be tested as rarely before, John. And I'll simply say this: whatever the challenges of this country, and they are many, we all know they are many, if we don't lead, who does? If we don't lead, who fills the vacuum? Who's the alternative to us, to the United States, in terms of global leadership? So if we don't, if we falter, if we hesitate, if we bicker and argue among ourselves, then we have reason to worry, John, big reason to worry.
That's a beautiful answer. I mean, I think Putin's record, and you referenced Munich. I mean, I think you could, the time of Munich was actually probably 20 years ago. He leveled Grozny and basically made it an unlivable city. He tried to assassinate the former presidential candidate for Ukraine, who ended up losing a fraudulent election, and then having the Supreme Court overturn that election and then getting elected after being poisoned. He's poisoned numerous other people, aggressions in Georgia and in the Georgia breakaway regions. And, there are numerous times when the world could have stepped in. You're absolutely right. And I think this is almost the last chance, the last gasp, I think, that we have. In that regard, can you speak? So one of the things that I think I love most about AJC is the fact that in traveling the world with you, seeing firsthand how Jewish communities, large and small, in the diaspora around the world, have little access sometimes to their own governments, but that these governments will sometimes speak to us, to an American Jewish organization, because of that American influence that you just spoke about. Can you speak specifically? So when you were in Ukraine in January, you met with the Ukrainian Jewish community, which is a large diaspora community. Tell me your insights into their current state. What are they experiencing? What is their health? Are they going to, Jessica and I just had dinner with a Ukrainian emigre friend of ours, Jewish emigre friend of ours here, who said that she's aware of some people maybe even receiving Israeli passports, for example, men, so that they can leave the country legally under Ukraine's no Ukrainian male citizen can leave the country. Can you speak a little bit to the current state of the Ukrainian Jewish community in regards to their government and in the current situation right now?
Sure, but just allow me to add one point from the last question, John. In 1994, Ukraine signed what became known as the Budapest Memorandum. It was a document that was endorsed by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. And what it provided for was the withdrawal of that nuclear arsenal that you spoke about at the beginning, the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, it was completely removed from Ukrainian territory in exchange for promises of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And again, I repeat, that was endorsed by the United States of America. We gave our word. Forget Russia for a moment. Fast forward. Ask yourself the question, if Ukraine had not given up that nuclear arsenal, but continued to have nuclear weapons on its soil today, would Russia have invaded?
You're absolutely right. That was the James Baker push to get nuclear weapons out of what he thought would be an unstable post-Soviet government at that time. You're absolutely right. Probably not. And by the way, would Munich be? Would the memories of Munich be even louder right now, and our ability to challenge the Russians be the same if Putin didn't have nuclear weapons right now? Hitler didn't have nuclear weapons in 1933, but Putin does today, which I think complicates things tremendously.
I'll go even further. If you are the leader of North Korea, and every so often the United States comes along and speaks about a denuclearized Korean peninsula, with all kinds of guarantees by the United States that if you, the North Korean leader, give up your nuclear weapons, which you have, we know you have, we will guarantee you A, B, and C, we will guarantee you economic prosperity, we will guarantee you diplomatic relations with the United States, blah, 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 blah. And you, the North Korean leader, look at Ukraine today, or I could add Libya, after Libya gave up its weapons of mass destruction to President George W. Bush, would you ever give them up?
Right.
Would you ever give them up? Would Pakistan ever give up its nuclear weapons under any circumstance for so-called solemn guarantees from the major powers? Our credibility is on the line here. This is about global security. This is about the future of our children, nothing less. As far as the Jewish community is concerned, John, the estimates are anywhere up to 300,000 Jews. They play a very active role in Ukrainian life. As I mentioned, a president, a prime minister, a defense minister, you added, major business people, cultural figures, go down the list. We don't see as yet any evidence that Jews have somehow been singled out or targeted by the Russian invaders. Nor do we see any backlash in Ukraine against President Zelensky. Of course, we saw the Russian attack on Babi Yar. There were two missiles, one that struck a TV tower sort of next door and one that struck the entrance, and I believe killed a family that was actually visiting Babi Yar. But we have not seen evidence as yet of any serious anti-Semitism or targeting of Jews as Jews. We're watching, and later today, actually, we have at least two phone calls scheduled with Jewish leaders in Ukraine to get their latest take. And if that changes, of course, we'll act accordingly. But I need to say something else here, John, and it's really important. If I may add, particularly in a place like the Bay Area, which I visited a few weeks ago, thanks to Serena's hospitality. Suffice it to say that in the Bay Area, both in the Jewish and non-Jewish communities, there's not necessarily widespread understanding of, much less feeling for the state of Israel. There are big pockets, as we both know, of hostility to Israel, alienation from Israel, uncertainty about Israel. Obviously, there are big pockets of support, but the Bay Area being the Bay Area, it's not consistent. At least for Jews, I would hope. What's happening in Ukraine is a reminder of why Israel exists. And if you speak to any Ukrainian Jew, as I have on multiple occasions, the whole concept of Israel for them is radically different than it is for too many Jews in America today. For too many Jews in America today, Israel has become a kind of political hobby. I like the prime minister, I like the party, I don't like the prime minister, I don't like the party, I like this policy, but I don't like that policy. So Israel is up, Israel is down. It's like the Dow Jones Industrial Average in recent weeks. For Ukrainian Jews, it's a totally different understanding of what Israel means. I don't think there's a Ukrainian Jew today who could care less who the prime minister is, or what party's in power, or what policy is going on here or there. For them, Israel is a lifeline. It is a safety valve. It is a home and a haven if they have to leave. We've seen on TV more than 1.5 million Ukrainians have fled already. They are now mostly in Poland, but also in Hungary, in Romania, in Moldova, in Slovakia, and elsewhere. What's their future? No one can be certain. I can tell you what the future of Jews who are displaced from Ukraine is. Their future is a country that wants them, is prepared to offer them a welcome, citizenship, absorption, language training, job training, and a sense of identity. That's the meaning of Israel in the year 2022 for 300,000 Jews in Ukraine, whether they choose to go or whether some have relatives in San Francisco or New York and try to get here instead. But that's the fundamental meaning of Israel. And I only wish, John, that more Jews today in America, and especially younger Jews in places like Brooklyn and Berkeley, would understand the true meaning of the state of Israel for Ukrainian Jews today. It means hope, it means opportunity, it means safety, it means a new start. That's the essence of Israel.
That's a beautiful answer. There was an opinion piece in the Times of Israel, I think today or yesterday, basically saying that the Ukraine of 80 years ago is not the same as the Ukraine today, and gave that as the reason. There was no Israel 80 years ago, at the time of Babi Yar. There is today. I think that's an absolutely beautiful point. To the Israel question, we had a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, and I was going to ask something similar to this. Israel's in a very delicate position right now. It's had an ongoing relationship with Russia, obviously, necessarily because of Iran's encroachment on Israeli territory through Syria, which is basically Russian-controlled airspace. And obviously, Israel's had very, very close relationships with the government of Ukraine, with the Ukrainian people on a whole host of different levels, from political, military, cultural, you name it. Although Israel voted in favor of the resolution condemning the Russian invasion at the UN, was formally on record as such, was not one of the 34 or 35 abstainers. They haven't been, some people feel Israel hasn't been quite as out front in its opposition to the invasion. And even trying to play an interlocutor, if possible, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. What is your take on this? How is Israel going to get itself out of such a delicate geopolitical situation? Obviously, we all know that Israel feels and supports the Ukrainian cause, but what can it do practically in the position it's in?
So today is Monday. So 8 days ago, in other words, Sunday, a week ago, we were in Israel. I met with Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, and with other Israeli officials, together with my AJC colleagues. And this was very much at the top of the agenda. There really were two issues at the top of the agenda, this one and Iran. Iran may be a separate conversation, although maybe we can tie it together, John, before we wrap up. As you said, Israel's in an extraordinarily difficult position. And again, I'm always struck in the world in which we operate that there are sort of ideological purists. The ideological purists are usually the people who bear absolutely no consequences for what they say. So they can say whatever they may think. In this case, well, of course, Israel has to side with Ukraine in every way possible and give the middle finger to the Russians. Now, that's very easy to say if you're sitting on your couch in your living room, and there are absolutely no consequences for saying it, whether you're right or you're wrong. But in the real world in which Israel operates and its friends operate, Israel is caught between a rock and a hard place here. Obviously, its heart and its head are with the Ukrainians. How could they not be? I mean, we Jews have a history. We were attacked as the weaker, the more vulnerable. We were occupied. We were massacred. So it's clear where the Israeli heart is. But the story cannot end there, because the reality is that Russia sits on Israel's border. And that border is called Syria. And Iran and Hezbollah are actively operating in Syria and across Syria. And the truth of the matter is, and it's a poorly kept secret, that without coordination between Israel and Russia, Israeli forces cannot operate as they have been operating in Syria. Without a Russian blind eye, or without Russia coordinating airspace with Israel, there's bound to be a clash. There's bound to be an accident. There's bound to be a dogfight. And if that happens, Israel, for all of its strength, is a country of 9 million people up against the Russian bear. Not so simple. And to those who, again, give the middle finger and say, to hell with it. Well, if they're the ones serving on Israel's northern border, if they're the ones who are going to be targeted by the Iranian and Hezbollah assets in Syria, then it's one thing. They may or may not be right, but they certainly they've earned the opportunity to express their view. But for those who are thousands of miles away and want to give Israel morality lessons, again, explain how Israel will manage against Iranian and Hezbollah assets that use Syria to plan attacks on Israel. And the other thing is, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews in Russia. And Putin, until now, for all of his many, many sins, has not been an anti-Semite. On the other hand, Putin does not have much of a soul or a whole lot of sentiments. If he decides to turn against the Jews of Russia, all hell will break loose. And for those of us who are veterans of Russian assaults on Jews over years, decades, and yes, centuries, it can become very painful very quickly. So Israel is under enormous pressure. It's trying to navigate. It's frankly walking or tiptoeing across a minefield. I think it's done it relatively well until now. I mean, we've chosen to be more outspoken, but we're not a government, AJC. And in a way, it's important for us that the world know that there are Jewish voices standing with Ukraine, as my backdrop indicates. But I accept the fact that Israel is not in the same position as AJC. It's a lot trickier. Final point, John, no matter where one comes out on this issue, it's pretty stunning to see the Prime Minister of Israel being asked by the President of the United States and the leaders of Europe to go back and forth to Moscow and in conversation with President Zelensky in Ukraine, and to try and somehow negotiate this, whether Bennett is successful or not. You know, to see this drama unfold with the President of Ukraine, a Jew, the principal negotiator today, the Israeli Prime Minister, by the way, the Secretary of State of the United States, a Jew. This is one hell of a Jewish story. Not that we want it to be. Not that we want it to be. We don't. But hey, it is.
that's the irony is not lost on us. I think. So putting on your geopolitical strategist hat here for a second, we've gotten a lot of questions about this. What is the best possible outcome in Ukraine right now? What can we do? Putin has, as you mentioned, threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. He's put his nuclear forces on alert. He's waived, and there are true legitimate questions about his mental capacity, I think, right now, his mental condition, given that he's been so isolated during the coronavirus pandemic and such, and may not be getting good advice from a whole bunch of different sources. What do you think about specifically the question of a no-fly zone in Ukraine? And people can define that different ways. It can mean, jets enforcing no-fly zones. It can mean giving surface-to-air defenses to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. It can mean giving them military equipment to hopefully defend themselves. What do you think is something that we can do now to save Ukraine, and what is the best possible outcome?
I think if I had a good answer for you, John, I wouldn't be talking only to this synagogue congregation. I hopefully would be called to the Oval Office and the 7th floor of the State Department to share the ideas. But I mean, generally speaking, as a lifetime observer of Moscow and Russian behavior, Putin, I have to believe, thought this would be a cakewalk.
Yeah.
I don't think for a single moment that he expected to be in the position he's in, but 12 days into this invasion. That doesn't mean he won't win on the ground, but he's met much more fierce resistance than he ever expected in Ukraine, and bravo to the Ukrainians. I mean, for showing remarkable courage, number one. Number two, he has managed unexpectedly to unite Europe as never before. I mean, for those of us who love Europe but sometimes wonder if it has a backbone, well, Europe has discovered its backbone. Sweden, neutral Sweden, Sweden that kept neutral during the Second World War and the Cold War, is now shipping weapons to Ukraine. Switzerland is now shutting down access to bank accounts against its own banking tradition of secrecy for centuries. Germany has boosted its defense spending massively and has now said it will put on ice Nord Stream 2, which should never have gone into play in the first place, but nonetheless, better late than never. Germany, I think, has now entered an era which I'm calling the post-war Germany, where it's realized that its essential pacifism, sort of its non-military approach to the world, has to give way to a shared defense of our common values and our common space. The transatlantic partnership is as strong as it's ever been now, John. After hesitation, we have gone after the SWIFT banking system. Many American companies are now shutting down their operations, which hurt Russia. I can keep going, but it's not enough. We have to create a balance sheet, John, where Putin begins to believe that the costs outweigh the benefits, or where Putin's entourage believes the costs outweigh the benefits and believe that Putin has led them down the wrong street. Also a possibility. I mean, this, after all, is Russia. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. It's possible. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's possible. I think the key in all of this, John, is really two. I mean, it's more, but one is Putin. I will bet you every ruble I don't have. Putin is betting that we will blink. We, the West, have no Sitzfleisch. We have no patience today. We have no ability for the long haul. We're gonna yield shortly, he believes, John. The pain of $4 or $5 or $6 a gallon gasoline is just going to be too much. So he believes that we're weak. We're going to throw in the towel. We're going to accept the new status quo. By the way, just as we accepted Crimea and Donbass and Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria, today it seems like a big deal, but by tomorrow, who's going to remember Mariupol or Kharkov or Kiev or Dnipropetrovsk? Who's going to remember them in his mind? So number one, John, we have to rediscover in the West our backbone and our perseverance. That ain't going to be easy. And the second thing we have to do, and let's be frank about this, and it's not going to go over well in states like California where you live or New York where I live, we're going to have to reconsider our energy policies. We have no choice. Again, the purists are going to come along as they have and say, you know, we want to visualize this perfect world, with no carbon emissions and no impact on the planet. And believe me, I'm all for it. All for it. As a citizen, as a father, and now as a grandfather. On the other hand, Putin believes he has this over a barrel, quite literally, a barrel of oil. And if gas came in a barrel of gas. He believes it. And he believes that our insatiable appetite, our unquenchable thirst for that four-wheel vehicle that too many Americans drive, et cetera, is going to send us right back to our politicians saying, get off the back of the Russians. We're not willing to pay $5 and $6 a gallon gasoline. We want to go back to the good old days. We have to create an energy policy, we in the United States, we outside of the Russian orbit, that essentially says that's his one major asset, John. That's where his money comes from. It doesn't come from selling caviar. It comes from oil and gas. Look at the price of oil and gas today. Putin is laughing to the bank. So the only way to deal with a Putin, it's very nice that AJC put stand with Ukraine, but will it change Putin's mind? Of course not. What will change Putin's mind? Thousands of Russian soldiers coming back in body bags and mothers clamoring in front of the Kremlin saying, why did our son die? Why did our daughter die? And Russians being isolated and being unable to travel to France or to Switzerland to hug their money or to engage in banking transactions with the rest of the world and feeling increasingly isolated. Russia needs to hurt. And when Russia hurts, let Russians ask Putin, why did you make us hurt? Why did you make us hurt? Unless we change this calculation, what else is going to stop him, John?
Well, a perfect segue to the final question I wanted to ask you, which is probably going to be the hardest question you're going to have to answer today. But I'm personally curious to know what your answer is going to be. So along those lines, what you just said. So first of all, I think in San Francisco, I think what you said is absolutely true. Even the Green Party in Germany, which makes the San Francisco environmental progressive constituency, I think, look conservative by comparison, is advocating exactly what you just said. Or at least there are indications they are. And they're the second most prominent party in the current German coalition. So you're absolutely right. So here's the tough question. There are American diplomats now flying to Venezuela, and there are almost certainly American diplomatic discussions going on with Iran about negotiating or coming up with the replacement for the JPOA agreement, the denuclearization agreement that was in place, that was abrogated by the Trump administration. And the reason for this is if the world under American and European leaderships decides to shut off the spigot, so to speak, the Russian oil and gas spigot in the middle of the wintertime, other than the Chinese, the Russians will have nowhere else to sell their oil, but there'll be a major hole on the world oil market. And there's a sense that needs to be backfilled by countries like Venezuela and possibly Iran, which may lead to a less than ideal nuclear agreement with Iran. What should we as American Jews be advocating for? Because on one hand, we understand the sacrifice that's required to cut off the Russian spigot, and on the other hand, there are political realities that the Biden administration, either he himself or a Democratic successor, want to be reelected. And so to do that, they need to make the pain as bearable as possible here and in the rest of the West, to keep the alliance going as well. What should we do?
I was going along with your whole question until you said Biden wants to be reelected. And here, I'll sound...
or his successor. Have a Democrat. Right.
It's a different point. Here I would like to be a little bit more idealistic. I believe that leaders need to lead, not follow. True leaders in a democratic society, they need to do what they believe is absolutely right. To hell with the consequences. Now that happens very rarely, John. Leaders tend to follow. They're so busy studying the polling data, the group data, that they're lacking the spine to lead. We are a country that is more than capable, we've shown it, of achieving full energy independence, not only, but also being able to export excess energy to other countries, including liquefied natural gas to Europe, which is heavily dependent on gas now, mostly from Russia. Again, if we're dealing with the purists, there'll be a non-conversation, which is one of the many reasons that I'm so hungry for the center of American politics, the sort of the reasonable, rational center-right, center-center, and center-left to kind of reemerge and take control of this country, because the lunatics on both sides are running us into brick walls on both sides.
Right.
The loony left and the radical right, who live in their own worlds, not the real world. The radical right wants to turn America inward. Well, have we just had another reminder, if we needed one, of what happens if America is perceived to be turning inward or retreating? The rest of the world has a field day, and the loony left lives in their own world of their hermetically sealed sort of ideologies and doctrines, and tries to shut down anyone who even dares to disagree with any part of it. We live in a wonderful world and a dangerous world, and Putin has reminded us of the dangers of the world. And that means that we have to make tough decisions. And sometimes decisions are imperfect decisions. They're between bad and worse. So energy independence comes with a cost. Yes, it does. But the absence of energy independence comes with another cost, which I would argue today is even higher. When it comes to Iran and to Venezuela, I mean, my biggest fear, John, at the moment is that the United States will be so tempted to strike a deal with Iran right now. Right now, our plate is so full in Washington. The lowest hanging fruit is the Iran deal, they believe. We have to deal with Russia and Ukraine. We have to deal with China. These are massive issues. So what's the easiest to get off the plate? Well, it's not China and it's not Russia. So the easiest to get off the plate is Iran. Now, Iran also happens to have energy. So are there going to be side deals, secret annexes? I don't know. But if I'm an Iranian leader right now, I'm smelling an American eagerness to finish a deal, and maybe to my advantage in Iran. And just one more point, John, before we wrap up. Follow the Iranian-Russian axis. Follow what's being discussed right now, both bilaterally and what the Russians are demanding of the Iranian nuclear negotiations in order to protect their relationship with Iran, including in the atomic energy field. This is really, really dangerous stuff, John. Really dangerous stuff. And here, my final point. I'm a nonpartisan. I've been so all my life. But right now, I am praying for the Biden administration, not because I'm a Democrat, but because as an American, we must get this right. John, if we get this wrong, there can be no schadenfreude. The Republicans may for a moment jump for joy that Biden's getting it all wrong, but the biggest consequence of getting it wrong, John, is that the world will become a far more dangerous place, far more dangerous than we could ever imagine. Pray for the Biden administration to get it right now, and then vote as you wish come November and come 2024. And meanwhile, AJC uniquely is engaged with Ukraine. We established a fund. We have raised to date over $450,000. We've already made our first allocations. And I will tell you, John, that this Wednesday night, having just returned last night from the Middle East, I'm going to Poland, where I'm going to be spending time on the border with Ukraine in order to meet refugees, to meet the rescue workers, to see where the needs are, and to see how specifically AJC can help. We want to help. We want to stand with Ukraine.
Thank you, David. What a wonderful way to end the conversation. The link for donations to the AJC Emergency Fund for Ukraine is in the chat. If everybody clicks on it, you'll be able to go to that page. And so with that, David, thank you so much. This is everything I could have ever imagined it would be. I wish it were under better circumstances, of course, but being associated and traveling with you over the last 20 years has been some of the greatest moments of my life. And I hope the 126 computers that joined us today can get a sense of that as well. So thank you again very much. I'll just end here by turning it over to Jessica again.
A great honor. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
So I just want to add my huge thanks to you, David, for being with us at Congregation Shareth Israel in the midst of this really complicated world situation, for taking the time to be with us here in San Francisco. We look forward to welcoming you in person in San Francisco. And thanks to Jonathan Graf for asking these really important questions from all over, from the questions that people chimed in with. And thank you for those great questions to all of you who wrote in. Thank you to Serena Eisenberg, Rabbi Serena Eisenberg, who brought us together today and made this happen. And thank you to all of you for being with us. This talk has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel coming up. And we look forward to hearing more about the great work that you're doing, David, and the extraordinary work of AJC for so many years and into the future. We're so grateful for your vigilance and your constant contribution to a safer and better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, John. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.